So welcome everybody, we are going to continue with our course. As you know, we meet next week for the last time. I can't believe my time is coming to an end so quickly. I just feel like I got here. As you recall, there are 5 pillars or 5 characteristics of early modern Jewish culture that we've been talking about. Last week, I'm just mentioning this for those of you that were not here. We spent the first session talking about historiography and the problem in general. The second week we talked about mobility and communal cohesion. Now I want to speak about an enormous topic, which is way beyond what I could do in 2 hours, but I'm going to sort of just try to sketch out some of the elements of this story. I call it knowledge explosion. And what I'm going to do is break it into 3 parts. And I'm not sure exactly the timing. Each of these subjects are worthy of a whole course. And if I were to do it right, I would do it with reading primary texts. And I have a whole bunch of texts that I would love to teach, but we don't have the time to do that. But I'm going to certainly mention a whole bunch of names and authors. But I want to cover 3 areas. The first area is print and its impact upon Jewish culture. So I want to speak about the printing press and talk about some of the latest conclusions with respect to this area. Then I want to broaden our discussion about cultural developments in general in the early modern period and speak about certain areas, genre of literature, of Hebrew and non-Hebrew writing that emerges in this period. Much of our focus will be on Italy, but elsewhere as well. But I want to speak about such subjects as rhetoric, history, autobiography, music, art. In other words, the shift then from the technical revolution in print and the actual manifestations of Hebraic culture in the early modern period. And then I want to speak about, and that will also include, although I'm not going to do a very good job with it, those of you that were with me yesterday heard me speak about a scientific text from the 18th century. I need to say a little bit about scientific works in the early modern period and development of interest on the part of Jews in natural philosophy and medicine and science. I've written a lot on that, therefore I'm reluctant to get into it because it's easier to speak about things you know less about in a shorter time. When you know so much more, it's harder. But the sciences are a part of our story as well, and particularly the phenomenon of the Jew entering the university, which is clearly an early modern phenomenon. And here Javier can argue with me that Jews were entering universities in the Middle Ages, but not really. I mean, you know, they were close by. They weren't necessarily in and full-time students. And then the third area is Christian Hebraicism. So I want to speak about the impact of Hebraic studies on Christians. And here, our main character could be, I mean, we could talk about the entire period and a whole group of individuals, but I think I will start by talking about Christian Kabbalah and Pico della Mirandola in Italy. So these are enormous subjects, and I'm just going to skim the surface. I apologize if I'm going too fast and covering, but I want to make the point that knowledge explosion, the availability of books, allow for a certain creativity which is an early modern phenomenon. I want to make the argument very strongly about the printing press with certain reservations. So let's begin, therefore, with print and the knowledge explosion and see how far we can get. What I want to do is give you a few examples because the field is large. Let me just start by saying, for those of you who are not early modernists, the critical book which transformed early modern history in general is the book by Elizabeth Eisenstein about the revolution of print in general and its impact upon Western culture. It originally was produced in the 1960s Hi, Sonia. And it created an enormous revolution in understanding. In other words, for her, the printing press transformed all of the major cultural movements of early modern Europe, from the Renaissance to the Reformation to the Counter-Reformation to the Scientific Revolution. All of these areas cannot be understood except for the technology of print and the accessibility of knowledge which prints created. Since Eisenstein has written her book, a whole field of the history of the book has developed, and it has also engendered a whole series of critics of Elizabeth Eisenstein. One of the most outstanding is a fellow, an Englishman named Adrian, how do we say, it's Johns or Jones? It's one of the two. If you look on your internet, you could tell me. Who wrote a very important critique of Elizabeth Eisenstein, in which he argued that technology itself doesn't change things, but cultural choices and creativity emerge. In other words, the printing press was a tool, was a resource that transformed culture, but the technology itself wasn't. There are other factors involved, and he tried to humanize the whole process of printing. The other area of critique, which is an extremely interesting one and a very technical one, is the argument that print did not simply replace the manuscript, but that the manuscript remained side by side with print. And in many respects, the act of reading is an act of incorporating print, but actually making comments on the side. Now historians of print love to look at printed books where there are comments written on the side, as if the manuscript is still there. And of course, the existence of manuscripts as prized possessions. In other words, print did not necessarily dislodge completely the previous culture of manuscripts. Yeah. Jones.
No, Johns.
Johns, then. It was Adrian Johns, okay? So if you're interested, and there's a splendid debate between Eisenstein and, I got it. Between Eisenstein and Jones. Now it's Johns, right? So it's Eisenstein and Johns, right? Okay. There's a splendid debate, I think 2002, 2003, in the American Historical Review between the two of them, which is a great debate. And you can see them talking about, in other words, has she exaggerated the emphasis upon the technology of print and the transformation of culture? And this initiated a whole series of other works. I'm still a novice in this area. As I mentioned yesterday in my lecture, University of Pennsylvania, where I teach, is a major center for the study of the history of the book and the material texts. All of my graduate students are the expression in Hebrew is "Heitzitzu v'nifga'u." How do you translate that? Help me. You got two Hebraists here, at least. Heitzitzu v'nifga'u. They looked at it and they were caught. They were caught up by it. They were excited by it. Heitzitzu v'nifga'u is an expression from the Haskalah, which talks about the fact that the Jews looked at non-Jewish culture and they became enamored of it. They became excited by it. In any case, all my graduate students are now historians of the book, much more than I am, but I have to be dragged along with them. So, but it's an incredibly interesting field, and there are all kinds of people that are working in this area, and you know, how a book is created, the business of printing, all of these aspects and so on, that have transformed culture, and clearly they have now entered into my narrative of Jewish history in a very serious way. All right, so having said that, in other words, I don't buy Eisenstein altogether, but I still want to make the argument with respect to Jewish culture that print is a very important factor here. And I think the best way to do it is to give you a few examples. So I'm going to give you 3 examples off the top of my head. And 2 of them come from a scholar who is a friend of mine and Javier, named Elchanan Reiner. I put the Jews the Jewish scholars in green and the non-Jewish in. She's Jewish, but Jones is definitely not Jewish. But you can't even read that. Reiner, R-E-I-N-E-R, Elchanan. And someday he may even come to Madrid if. I'm pushing too hard now. But in any case. Reiner, so the two examples I want to give you, the first is, let's focus on a scene. So we're talking about Venice, beginning of the 16th century. We're talking about a printer from Antwerp named Daniel Bomborg, who leaves Antwerp to come down to open a printing shop of great significance. He publishes books in Latin and other languages, but he also begins to publish Hebrew books. His greatest accomplishment is the creation of the first Talmud in printed Talmud, the Bomborg Talmud. I've seen it. We don't have the whole complete edition in our library for some reason, but I was visiting once a donor of mine in New York, and he collects books, and he opens up his closet, and there he has lying on the floor, the Bomborg Talmud, draped with, he has uniforms from the NBA. The NBA, the basketball, he had it on top of the Bomborg Talmud, and I just stood there shocked. How could he keep the Bomborg Talmud on the floor like that? But if you're rich, you just do what you want. And anyway, it was there. So he published the Talmud. He also published the first Mikraot Gedolot. That the Mikraot Gedolot is what we usually call the Rabbinic Bible. It is like the Talmud, if you recall, it is formatted. I'll keep these on. No, don't sit down. It is formatted. If this is the Talmud page, and similarly the Rabbinic Bible is similar. The biblical text is here. Rashi's commentary, Ibn Ezra commentary, all of these different commentaries of medieval commentators. The Talmud, of course, the formatting is very similar. The notion of placing the text in the middle and surrounding it with commentaries is itself, the formatting is revolutionary. It basically comes from Christian books, from canon law, from the way legal texts were studied, and essentially it was shaped and transformed by print. In other words, if you look at the manuscripts of the Talmud or of the Bible, you may have Rashi's commentary on the side, but you don't have 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 commentators all printed or formatted around you, and similarly in the case of the Talmud as well. So these two texts were revolutionary, not only in terms of printing them and disseminating them, but also in the way in which they were formatted. I love to bring, at Penn we have an enormous group of Orthodox Jewish kids that come from yeshivot who study at Penn. So I love to bring them into the rare book room of our center. We have an extraordinary library of 400,000 volumes in Judaica, one of the great libraries of the world. And so I take out the Bomborg Talmud, or I take out the Bomborg Mikraot Gedolot, the first Rabbinic Bible, and I say to them, here is the Talmud. All of you spent all your life studying the Talmud. So how did God give us the Talmud? Was it in this form? And I tell them that it was created by a Christian printer named Daniel Bomborg, and essentially he was imitating canon law. And they didn't learn that in yeshiva for some reason. They thought it came that way from God on Sinai. But in any case, let me go on with the story. So Mikraot Gedolot, so here's Elchanan Reiner. Mikraot Gedolot then is published in Venice, and it makes its way across the regional boundaries of Jewish life into Eastern Europe. And in Eastern Europe, the Jews in Krakow and the yeshiva of Moses Isserles pick it up, and they look at this text and they say, well, who studies Bible? Bible, that's what 6-7-year-olds do. We go right to Talmud. We don't waste our time reading Bible in particular. And over here, Rashi, he's one of our guys. He's a good Ashkenazi Jew. But who is this guy Ibn Ezra? Who is this guy Radak? Rabbi David Kimchi. We never heard of these guys. Are these our people? In other words, what is going on? And it actually creates a conflict, which a very famous conflict in Posen, which Reiner describes in great detail, between those who are reading, what are these books? In other words, Eastern Europe is relatively hermetically sealed off from the culture of Venice and Amsterdam and the West, but Jewish books are making their way. In other words, we talked about the mobility of people, now we're talking about the mobility of books. So all of a sudden, the Bible. Now so now we are privileging the biblical text. Now we are reading Sephardic commentators that were not well known in Eastern Europe. And at the same time, why is this press profitable? Why is Bomberg interested in selling Talmuds and selling Rabbinic Bibles in the first place? Because lots of people are buying them. First, he's selling them to Jews, but he's also selling them to Christians. And Christians are extremely attracted to the Rabbinic Bible. In other words, very few of them can read the Talmud, but the Rabbinic Bible, they're Ibn Ezra, and they're Kimchi, and these medieval commentators are extremely important to them. And they begin to quote them and use them all over the place. What is extraordinary here is a kind of literacy on the part of a Christian intellectual community that is learning Hebrew. And therefore, the biblical text is obviously critical for them. And as the history of the Rabbinic Bible is an extraordinary history, it begins modestly in Venice. Then there are several editions that follow from Bomberg and from other printers in Venice. But then the real great Rabbinic Bibles are those that were published at Amsterdam, which are extraordinary. I mean, with 10, 15, 20 commentators, and commentators in the back and the front, all over the place. In other words, it is an extraordinary achievement to put all of these different commentaries in the same volume, and it can be studied simultaneously. So what you're doing is getting a panorama of Jewish culture, of Jewish life. You are reading the text, but you're reading it through the prism, through a whole group of voices who are attempting to understand the text from their own perspective. The same goes for the Talmud. In other words, both of these productions are enormously successful because there are Jewish and Christian readers out there who are buying them in large numbers. And they penetrate Eastern Europe. Now let me give you a second example, which is also Reiner, but it's also Amnon Raz Krakowski and a whole group of others who have written on this subject. And that is what I would say the quintessential early modern book, which is, anybody guess? The Shulchan Aruch. Okay, also printed in many editions in Venice, but the edition that I want to speak about is, and I don't have the dates in front of me, but it is the edition of the end of the 16th century in Krakow. And the edition, of course, is important because the Shulchan Aruch, all right, so let's do that here. I'm going to write in Hebrew, but I won't do that. Shulchan Aruch is the Hebrew word for ordered table. And if you have an ordered table, you need a tablecloth, which is called a mapah. The author of the Shulchan Aruch is a Sephardic Jew named Yosef Cairo. And the mapah, which, as you will see, is a very important addition to the Shulchan Aruch, is by Moses Isserles. Cairo is Sephardic, Isserles is Ashkenazic. The Shulchan Aruch is one of the major codes of Jewish law. The other important code, there are many important codes, but the other important code of the Middle Ages is the Mishneh Torah of Maimonides. The Shulchan Aruch, in many respects, will eventually displace will become the most important code of Jewish law in the 16th century. According to Reiner, the story is a very interesting one here. Cairo himself is an extremely interesting figure. Cairo makes his way, as a Spanish Jew, makes his way to the Ottoman Empire and eventually to Safed, to Sfat in the 16th century. Cairo, who is the author of a rabbinic code, is also a mystic, and writes a work called Magid Mesharim, which is about an angel speaking in his ear, a Magid, and he has all kinds of visions. So the notion of a Kabbalist being a legalist, which was the title of Verblowski's very important 1950s biography of Cairo, is a very interesting notion for Christians in this period and later periods. The Kabbalah for them is a kind of self reform. It's a kind of cleansing of Jewish legalism. In other words, the Kabbalah, Jewish spirituality is one thing, and Jewish legalism is another. I mean, this is all a kind of Christian prejudice towards the nature of Judaism, that the two need to be split. And Christian Kabbalah, I mean, the best example of this, we'll talk about this later on, is Reuchlin's De Art Kabbalistica, which is an incredible work in which he presents a Kabbalist Jew who hates the Talmud, or the Christian would like him to hate the Talmud. In other words, there are these horrible people called Talmudists, but the good Jews are Kabbalists, because they're spiritual like we are, the Christians. But Cairo, of course, destroys that image, because Cairo is both a legalist and a Kabbalist at the same time. And that seems to typify much more. The Kabbalists didn't break from halacha, didn't break from Jewish law. They reinforced it with their own understanding of Jewish law and so on. Be that as it may, Cairo's work was published very early, and since he was a Sephardic Jew, it represented the traditions of Sephardic Judaism with respect to summarizing Jewish law. All of a sudden, it invades the Eastern European world, which by the 16th century is quite significant. In Poland, Lithuania, we spoke about the Vad Arba Atzot, the Council of Four Lands, the creation of this extraordinary community in the East. Now, according to Reiner, and here I got to be very brief, essentially the tradition of rabbinic scholarship prior to print is a culture of manuscripts, of where the orality of the teacher is the critical aspect of the school. What the last teacher says about a specific text, in other words, if there was one manuscript text that they had in class, he would interpret that text and people would listen to that text, and it was always kibatrai, that is, it was always according to the later rabbi. In other words, the later rabbi, unlike a Christian source where you go back to the earliest source for the most pure understanding, or a classical text. In this case, the up-to-date text was the last rabbi and his version of these texts. So rabbinic culture in Eastern Europe, and before that in Central Europe, in Germany, was very much based on local traditions, on orality, on the transformation of culture, on the fluidity of learning and culture that came out of this process. The Shulchan Aruch, however, is a very interesting attempt to arrest that process. Number one, you summarize the process rather than participate in the process. You summarize it, you give its conclusions, and you give the final word. In other words, Shulchan Aruch is not about what is called in Aramaic the shakla and the tarya of the text, namely the give and take of the process of arriving at the conclusion of the text. It gives you simply what the conclusion is. This is the law, period. Now Isserles, the great rabbi in Krakow, who had written commentaries on the text, in other words, hasagot, or commentaries, was the vehicle by which Jewish culture was transformed, but it was a fluid process. It was never closed. It was still an open process, is what he's trying to say. The Shulchan Aruch creates closure. Isserles was faced with a problem. What do I do? Do I join or do I fight? And he joined. He wrote his own hasagot, called the Mapah, and he added them to the printed edition in Krakow that appeared in 1580s, if I'm not mistaken. I don't remember the exact date. So now you have a Shulchan Aruch, which has the text of Joseph Caro, a Sephardic rabbi, and the Hasagot, the commentary, or actually making the text useful, available to Ashkenazic Jews by introducing Ashkenazic minhag, Ashkenazic customs. So now Ashkenazic Jews can study this book and use it as their final version of the text. What this does, however, is to arrest that process. Now we have a closed book. Now we have a final summation. In other words, the hasagot of the mapa were alive, but by putting them on the page, they become fixed. They become stationary. They become unchanging. According to Reiner, and this is a very provocative thesis, and we need not accept every bit and piece of this, like we need not accept Eisenstein, but it's a very interesting thesis they speak about. What happens now is several things. Number one, the rabbi and the teacher become less important. The book replaces the text. But the book replaces the teacher. Now, I don't know if you remember, but about 15 years ago, Chaim Soloveitchik wrote an article which has the word rupture in the title about what has happened to contemporary Orthodoxy, in which he argued there about talking about the 21st century, that essentially Orthodox Jews now are become too literal. They follow the text too much. The text has a certain orthodoxy around the text. What the text says is what we have to do. What Reiner is suggesting here is how that process began. In other words, through print. The Shulchan Aruch arrests the process of orality, of changing, and now the teacher can introduce changes because we have now an authoritative text. Would you take a printed volume like this and write in it and say, of course that happens. So in other words, it's not completely true that it fixed everything and nothing is changing. But nevertheless, it creates a certain authority. The other interesting thing about the Shulchan Aruch, however, for me is this. It is a quintessential early modern book because it fuses together an Ashkenazic and a Sephardic world. Okay? The Shulchan Aruch is now, with the Mapa, not simply a Sephardic book, it's also an Ashkenazic book. And if we are speaking about crossing boundaries, if we're speaking about the creation of a early modern Jewish culture as opposed to a Sephardic culture, or a Polish culture, or a German culture, or an Ottoman culture, the Shulchan Aruch becomes universally a text which Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews can use. It doesn't supplant completely the Mishneh Torah and the Smag and all these other codes. They all have their place in the Arbat Turim and so on, but nevertheless, it becomes the most important code of Jewish law. So that's my second example. Example number 3, and this is now no longer Reiner, it's me. One of the texts that I worked on for a long time is a medical text. And here is my way of introducing the study of medicine and science, even at this stage. I want to speak about a text written by a graduate of the University of Padua, a Jew named Tuvia HaKohen, Tobias Cohn, if you like English. And the text is called Maaseh Tuvia. Printed in Venice in 1708. Tuvia was a Jew from Ashkenaz, from Eastern Europe, who made his way to Frankfurt in the Oder and tried to get into the university there. And for a year, he struggled as a Jew, but they didn't want him. He finally went down to Venice, where he was accepted at the University of Padua, and he was a medical student at the end of the 17th century. He followed hundreds of Jewish students who were first accepted. The first university to accept Jews was the University of Padua. The University of Padua was a university which, as we said, I think, in the past, served primarily the children of Venetian people, noblemen, who Padua is only 10 kilometers from Venice, and it is still a great university town. It's very definitely worth visiting. You can see there the 16th century synagogue, which is still intact. I don't know, I think Rabbi Viterbi has retired, but essentially, I don't know if there's, I think there's a young rabbi there now, but the synagogue still has Friday night services, and what's interesting about the place is that I always wondered, I mean, when I walked out of the university, if you made a left, you could walk right into the Jewish ghetto, and if you made a right, you walked into this wonderful church where with the frescoes of Giotto. Have you ever been there in Padua? Yeah? That to me was the right combination. In other words, an Italian Jew who knows painting and knows Italian art, and at the same time knows how to go to the synagogue. That combination was very attractive, a very interesting one. At the same time, was studying the sciences at the University of Padua. In any case, Maaseh Tuvia, I shouldn't speak about the Venetian experience now, I should just speak about Tuvia. So Tuvia, the Ashkenazic Jew, graduates in 1689 or something like that, and immediately ends up with a very distinguished career as physician for the Sultan in Turkey, and spends most of his life in the Ottoman Empire. Now we know that he ends up in Jerusalem and dies in Israel. Aryeh Morgenstern has discovered a document describing Tuvia Kohen. When I got to Israel a couple of years ago, I discovered that one of the theaters in Jerusalem had actually written a musical with Tuvia Kohen as the star. I couldn't believe it. Tuvia Kohen had any interest to anybody but me, but nevertheless, so what did Tuvia Kohen write? Do you know in Spain Dr. Spock?
Yeah.
Has he been translated into Spanish?
I don't think so.
La Guerra de las Galaxias.
No.
Star Wars?
No.
No, not that Spock. No, Dr. Spock. When my parents had little babies, everybody had this Dr. Spock. Okay. This was a medical text that everybody learned how to take care of their children, and when they got sick and everything else. It was medicine for common people. Yeah. I won't call Maaseh Tuvia that exactly, because he saw himself as a very serious university graduate and so on. But Maaseh Tuvia was written as a medical textbook, which was actually written for Jews who do not have doctors that need to know anything about medicine. It is an extraordinary achievement, with pictures, with illustrations. I wish I had pictures of it and so on. The most interesting picture is a picture of a body and next to it a house. I bet if you went on the internet you could even find that picture, because I found t-shirts in Israel where they actually have the same picture. It's an extremely interesting illustration within Maaseh Tuvia. But it became a popular text that was published over and over again. And it's very interesting in the introduction where Tuvia Kohen says, look, I've been treated like crap, I had to leave Ashkenaz, I went south, I came to Venice. I finally decided that after I graduated Venice, I know as much as these Goyim know, as much as these non-Jews know, and I'm going to write a book that shows them that they're not so smart after all, and I'm as smart as them. This is what he says in the introduction. And therefore, so the book is about pride, is about chauvinism, about Jewish pride. We are not so stupid after all, and I can write a medical textbook as good as anybody else. And therefore we have this extraordinary textbook, which begins with the cosmology of the world, and then enters into a whole discussion of all kinds of medicines and treatments and so on. What is interesting about the book is that it reads like his lecture notes that he heard from his teachers at the University of Padua. He begins with medieval medicine, with Hippocrates and with Galen, but then he introduces all kinds of new physicians. And what is amazing about this text is that he is quoting especially what he calls the chemical philosophers. Those who are challenging the notion of four elements of Aristotle, who are rethinking the relationship between chemistry and medicine. And he actually quotes these texts, most of them written in Northern Europe, in Amsterdam or in London. He quotes them within 10 years of their publication. So the book is an encyclopedia of knowledge. And he even has, at the end, my fellows next year are going to be working on this. This is Francois Guinet's topic. he discovers a Jewish disease called plica polenica, which is the disease for Ashkenazic Jews. Oh, that's a picture of Tuvia Kohen. Yeah, he really looks Ashkenazic there. Ugly guy. But see if you can find the picture of of the body and the house, which is really quite extraordinary. What was I just talking about? So plica polenica is a disease where the Ashkenazic girls get their hair all braided up and then infected. There comes disease in the hair. And it's a kind of Polish-Jewish disease. So it has a long history, apparently in Latin source and so on. He devotes the last part of Masei Tuvia to how to treat plica polenica. So here is an Eastern European Jew who studies in Padua, who goes off to Turkey, where he dies eventually. But the book has a long, long history. So we have here a book with illustrations. We have a book with new medicine. We have a book with an up-to-date bibliography. This is Jewish culture at the beginning of the 18th century, the end of the 17th century. And it typifies the possibility that books have in spreading not only rabbinic culture, but also medical culture in this case. All right, so my point, so let me make a few general points. That's one of them, but that's not the one I'm talking about. No. All right, so let me make a very quick points. What time is it? 10 after, so we've gone 40 minutes already.
This one is very similar
To the one we found on, yeah, isn't that interesting? Maybe that's where they stole it from. But there's still a big one that you haven't found. All right, let me just say, make some general comments now about this whole phenomenon. What I want to suggest is that as we describe the mobility of people, we're just talking about the mobility of books. That's it, yeah, that's it. Yeah. Yeah, very.
This is in the cover of his book. You use that in the cover of your book.
Of my book, yeah, exactly, yeah. It's so you have on one side the parts of the body, and the other side he compares it to places in the stories of a house. And it's a very unique picture. I haven't found it. Someone wrote, actually, an art historian wrote about it. But here is the Jew utilizing print to spread a kind of Jewish message, in this case, about Jewish medicine. So what I want to suggest here is the creation of a whole new library of Jewish books, the spread of Jewish books, the mobility of Jewish authors and texts, Jewish books moving from the south to the north. We also hear of when the printing press begins in Poland, Lithuania, of Jewish books coming down from the north to the south. One of the most interesting books, which I'll talk about very briefly if I have the time today, Azaria de Rossi's Meorinayim, is a kind of scholarly work in which he compares Jewish chronology with Greek and Latin chronology, a very important book for ancient historians. One of the great masterpieces of Jewish scholarship in this period. The reason I mention it right now is because the Maharal of Prague, sitting in Prague, the great rabbi in Prague, reads the book almost instantaneously. The book is published in Mantua in 1575 and writes within a few years a very nasty response to it, saying this is crap, that he's not taking the rabbi seriously and that this is all wrong. But what I want to try to show you is look at how the Jewish world is connected. You can't make that argument for that quickly in the Middle Ages. In other words, there is a form of communication here that is going on through print and through the and footnotes emerge in this period as well. We have in the 17th century, for the first time, footnotes, the formatting of these books, the commentaries. All of these things are revolutionary in terms of how one presents Judaism to a public. So that's one thing. A second thing is the emergence of secondary elites. Now that printing becomes cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, you can print little pamphlets. Elizabeth Eisenstein spoke about the wars of religion between the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation through print, through little pamphlets. But here we have the Jewish peddler, the Jewish book dealer, publishing his drushes, you know. He wrote 3 little sermons, so he's going to publish them and sell them to anyone that wants to buy them. He gets up as a Magid, speaks and says, look, now you can buy my book. Here, I'll even sign it, all right? Or his book of skulot, of collections of remedies, of magical formula and so on. In other words, what emerges now is not only the high elite culture of Talmuds, but a low culture, a popular culture of drashot. Every author is now capable of publishing his book, and there's no control over this. In other words, the rabbis, the Bad Arbatzot in the Council of Four Lands in Eastern Europe tries to control publications, but it can't. During the Sabbatian crisis of the 17th century and the 18th century, books are being published by Sabbatians all over the place. Heretical works. We'll talk about one of them, Ozla Elohim, published in 1703, which creates a disaster, creates a major commotion. And those who are criticizing the Sabbatians are writing their own pamphlets and books. So, in fact, the Sabbatian controversy is enlarged, is enhanced because of print. Printing all of these little books all over the place creates their own momentum. So what emerges here is a secondary elite. Part of that secondary elite is the emergence, late in this period, but nevertheless during this period, of works written for women and children. Chava Weissler has written a book on the Techines literature. Techinot or Techines in Yiddish are what? You know what they are? These are prayers written for women about womanly kinds of things. Menstruation, challah making, lighting the candles, the mitzvot that are required of women. Initially they're written by men, but eventually they're written by women. And Chava Weissler, a major feminist in America, makes this book into a kind of book of advocacy, in which he describes a genre of literature emerging by women, which became extremely important in terms of defining who they are and what their priorities are, and so on and so forth. Later on, we have more and more books written, and mostly by men, but in some cases by women. The emergence of the woman author I mentioned last time is more an 18th century phenomenon, but nevertheless it emerges already in this period of time. And several scholars have written works about women and the role of books in disseminating knowledge. So that's another aspect. A third aspect which is related to this, and I mentioned this in passing already, is what I would argue the creation of two new Jewish languages, which are propelled, accelerated by print, Yiddish and Ladino. The Yiddish book is a book that is written and accessible to non-specialists, non-elites. So therefore, the Yiddish book is also important for women as well. And the Tzena Urena, a commentary that is written primarily for women and non-educated Jews, it clearly reflects this new need. So, in other words, there's an explosion of material, of knowledge, which is going in all kinds of areas, which are involving groups that were clearly not the elites. This is, again, part of the revolution of print. Cheap books, secondary elite, of shattering the hegemony of the rabbis, and so on and so forth. I mentioned, or I don't know if I mentioned it in passing, I just one or two more comments I want to make about this. One is, first of all, the beginning of an enormous, it begins modestly but becomes more and more important as time goes on, of works written by Jews in non-Jewish languages. In other words, addressing the non-Jew, apologizing for Judaism, or explaining Judaism, or articulating a Jewish image. I'm referring specifically to works like the Riti, a work written by Leon Modena in Venice, the rabbi of Venice, who writes a work in which he presents the Jewish ceremonies to the non-Jewish world. This book went through all kinds of translations into all kinds of languages, including English. And it became a major vehicle for explaining Judaism to a non-Jewish world. Similarly, the case of Simone Luzzatto, Ma'amar al Yehudei Venezia, Discorso al Ebrei in Venezia, is an attempt to explain politically, economically, and socially who the Jews are to the Doge of Venice, to the non-Jewish public. In other words, the beginning of apologetic works written by Jews, written in Latin, written in Italian, written in French, written in English. In other words, the beginning of a literature of Jews who are become aware of the other and the need to explain Judaism to the other in a way that will influence public opinion. In the case of Luzzato's work, which is a work which I love, I've studied Simone Luzzato. Luzzato was the other 17th century rabbi of Venice. His work was written for political reasons to explain the economic utility and political utility of Jews. But he has an extraordinary chapter, chapter 16 of the book, which talks about, which gives you a cultural profile of Judaism. There are three kinds of Jews, he says. There are Talmudists, there are philosophers, and there are Kabbalists. Now that's a very interesting way of defining Judaism. In other words, in part, it shares the Christian Reuchlin way of dividing up Kabbalists from Talmudists. And he gives you a genealogy of each, a kind of history of the great Talmudists, and then the great philosophers, Maimonides, and so on and so forth, and then finally, Kabbalists. And he includes in that group also people who are interested in nature and natural study, and he puts them also in the philosophical group. And you could say that he's presenting Judaism in a way to try to connect Jewish intellectual life with a non-Jewish world, so it's all apologetic. But you also might argue, and I'll perhaps do this in the next hour, that he's actually understanding Judaism in this way. But the work is written in Italian. When I say Mamar al Yehudei Venezia, that's the Hebrew translation that was done in the modern age. But the work was originally written in Italian. So Jews writing in non-Jewish languages. One or two more things. The creation of a group of books that now a young scholar, she's getting a little older, Lucia Raspi is working on, called Sifrei Minhagim. These are works, I think we talked about this before, custom books. What I also wanted to mention is Zev Grease's contribution, Sifrei Hanagot, which are moral texts. One of the most interesting aspects of the Sabbatean controversy was the publication of all kinds of moralistic texts based on Isaac Luria. But as we talked about in my lecture yesterday, for those of you who were there, these were popular Lurianic texts. They weren't technical, they weren't hard to understand, and they focused particularly on the area of morality and ethics. The most famous, of course, emerging in the 18th century by Rabbi Moses Chaim Lutzato, called the Mesilat Yesharim, the great moralistic text based upon Kabbalistic ideas and so on. So again, this explosion of moral texts, Sifrei Hanagot, Regiment Vita, are texts that are written essentially to talk about moral and ethical values. These explode within the 16th and 17th century well and go all over the place, and are small books that regular Jews can read. Finally, I want to speak about the work of, in terms of, we're still on Unit 1. I don't know how I'm going to get to the Unit 2 and 3, but do my best I can. The work, well, we call him, his nickname is No-No, but his full name is Raz, I'll just give you, is unknown, but Raz Brakotskin. I don't even know how to spell it, Brakotskin. And the book is about censorship. I don't remember the title of the book, but I did publish it in my series, but I don't remember the title. And the argument here is a really interesting one. It's already been refuted by Piet van Boxel in Oxford and so on, but whatever the refutation, it's a very provocative book. Essentially argues, you remember in the middle of the 16th century in Italy, Pope Paul IV burns the Talmud, in 1553 to be precise. This is a disaster. After the Talmud has been produced for 50 years, all of a sudden now the Talmud is burned.
The censor, the editor, and the text.
The censor, the editor, and the text. That's the name of this book. After the burning of the Talmud, the Jewish community tries to recover. It studies the Talmud through its codes. It publishes a lot of midrash. Kabbalah is published during this period of time. But what emerges now is a new strategy on the part of the church, or a reinforced strategy of censorship. Now, censorship doesn't only apply to Jews, it applies to all kinds of books, but now the Catholic Church sets up an office of censorship whereby Hebrew books are being evaluated and studied and so forth. What emerges, according to Krakowski, is a very interesting figure. The censor is an Hebraist. Quite often he was a former Jew who knows Hebrew perfectly. So he's an Hebraist. In other words, that's a new category of Christian, a Christian who knows Hebrew. He's interested in looking at Hebrew texts and finding that they're not necessarily offensive to Christianity. But he doesn't want to destroy these texts. He's willing to allow these texts to be printed if they are cleaned up, if they're censored, if they're refined. So the process is very interesting here. According to Amnon Raz-Krakowski, there's something bad, obviously, about censorship. On the other hand, there's something that's very beneficial. Number one, the books aren't being burned anymore. Number two, Jews are learning to anticipate what the censor is looking for. So therefore, the Jew is learning how to talk about himself without attacking or the other. In other words, learning how to describe your own identity without attacking Christianity. To remove any references to Jesus and so on and so forth. So therefore, and what emerges according to Krakowski, and maybe this picture is a bit too idyllic, is the printing press is a place where Christians and Jews are working together. We saw the case of Bamberg, but he's not the only Christian printer. There are many Christian printers. Together with Christian typesetters, Jewish readers who are reading the Hebrew work, and the censor joins them as well. In other words, participates in the experience. Sometimes pre-censors the books before it's even published. And therefore, what emerges is a kind of community of interest in publishing the Hebrew book made up of Jews and Christians together. In other words, in all the places where Jews and Christians can meet each other in early modern Europe, the university, the public square, the coffee house, now we have the printing press. The printing house is a place where Jews and Christians are interacting with each other, creating Hebrew books. So the censor is a kind of neutral observer of Jewish texts. He's not out to polemicize or burn or deprecate. He simply wants to remove any references to that are negative with respect to Christianity. Now this picture may be a bit too simplified, but nevertheless it's very interesting. A book was mentioned yesterday, which I love to talk about. It's a book by Solomon Ibn Verger called the Shevet Yehuda. The Shevet Yehuda is a work published in the middle of the 16th century. It is a work of history, of polemics, of Jewish-Christian relations. The 7th chapter of the book, the Shevet Yehuda, the Rod of Judah by Ibn Verga, has become, and eventually we may even have a critical edition in English. In the 7th chapter, there is an imaginary dialogue which the author talks about between a Spanish king and his Christian advisor, Tomas. Now, Tomas, Raz Krakowski makes this analogy, is like the censor. Tomas is a Christian advisor, but he's a secular advisor. He's not a priest. The king asks him, why are Jews hated? Why are they single? So here it engages a kind of a literary dialogue about the causes of anti-Semitism. And Thomas goes on and on talking about them, and it's really one of the most interesting chapters in the history of early modern Jewish literature, which I would love to teach, but I'm not going to talk about. I just want to mention the figure of Thomas. Because Thomas is the kind of person who is analogous to the Hebraist. The Hebraist is a new figure on the Jewish Christian scene. He is sympathetic to Hebrew sources. He realizes the importance of Hebrew culture for understanding Christianity. He is an avid fan of reading Hebrew books, and he has no access to grind. He is still a Christian. He's not necessarily a Jew, but nevertheless, he emerges as a kind of of student of religion who can appreciate Judaism on its own right without attacking and vilifying it. In this respect, Thomas, that advisor to the king, is a kind of imaginary Hebraeus. In other words, he is a person that knows, understands, is objective, or at least semi-objective, and clearly does not have any access to grind. That is a new kind of figure here. So for him, the printing shop is a place for the shaping of new attitudes between Christians and Jews, and beyond that, of course, in the larger Jewish Christian world. We'll come back to the Christian Hebraeus at the end of my remarks, but clearly the censor, therefore, and the story of the printing shop, the social history of the printing shop is the final piece in this story of print. So to summarize this part, essentially, print is a revolution, and is certainly a revolution for Jewish life. I've only described Venice and the print, or Krakow, but we have printing presses that emerge, of course, throughout the Ottoman Empire, throughout Eastern Europe, into Germany. I could have talked, and I will talk more about the printing presses. The most important printing press is the printing press in Amsterdam, which publishes Hebrew works, it publishes Yiddish works, it publishes works by Christian Hebraeus. Christians and Jews are publishing together. Is an extraordinary place where books are being printed from Eastern European Jews are coming to Amsterdam, publishing Yiddish books going back to, so we have here, again, the mobility of books and booksellers and so on. But you see, this dynamic universe is a universe that did not exist in the Middle Ages, and opens up extraordinary possibilities for the creation of new avenues of knowledge and understanding. So that's my unit number 1. I have 3. I'm not going to get to them all today because it's now 12:30. Wow. So I'm going to have to combine the next 2 a little more briefly. But so we went on for an hour. Any questions or comments about this? Of course, you have my book, right? Those of you that have registered for the course. If any of you are not registered and want my book in a PDF, just send me an email and I'll send it to you. But the 3rd chapter of the book deals with this subject, so you can fill in with all kinds of bibliography there as well. Okay? Any questions or comments? Are we set now? So, you want to add something? Yeah, go on.
You mentioned the question of Christians collaborating with Jews in the edition of Jewish texts. What's on the other side? Jews collaborating with Christians in the edition of Christian texts.
Yes. Well, I can think of several examples from later on, but
Even earlier.
All right, you're talking about the complete, about the.
No.
You're talking about the creation of.
No, I'm not talking of converts. I'm talking of.
No. But I'm talking about what we saw in Alcala. When we're talking about we're talking about the creation of what do you call it? What's the word I'm looking for? The creation of the Polyglot Bibles. Yes.
No, I was talking about one. At least I know 2 examples in Spain.
Yeah.
Produced 1492 of
Right.
Christians, of Jews.
Collaborating with Christians.
Printing Christian books.
Ah.
Christian pious books.
All right, that's really
These
interesting.
are, in one of the cases, this is a Jew who is going to publish later on Jewish
Fascinating.
books.
Wow. All right. So I mean,
I don't know if that's phenomenon you.
I don't know that phenomenon. I mean, clearly what the great masterpieces of the early modern period is the Polyglot Bible, which is an attempt to put together all of the translations of the Bible on one page. And the most impressive of the polyglots is Thomas Haid edition, which comes out in London, and you wouldn't believe it. It is a masterpiece of printing. Obviously, Jews were involved in all of the polyglots, or at least converted Jews, and so on. I'm also thinking of another example, which is really interesting. In Amsterdam, Menashe ben Israel creates a Mishnah Menukedet, a pointed text of the Mishnah. Who is that for? And he gets money from Christians. The Christians are collaborating with him. So he's creating a Mishnah. The Mishnah becomes extremely important for Christians. I have a whole book on this subject with respect to England. The Mishnah becomes extremely important for Christians. They discover the Mishnah as the way to get to Jesus. Mishnah is Jesus. It's only 2 years afterwards, but nevertheless, The revival of Mishnah studies, which is also part of early modern Judaism. Mishnah is very important for the Maharal of Prague. It's very important for the Kabbalist in Safed. But the Christians discovered the Mishnah. So here, Menashe ben Israel is putting out a Mishnah with vowels so they can read it. And you could say it's also for ignorant Jews, but it's possible it's also for Christians. So it does work the other way. Also, the creation, what's the guy's name? This is another book of mine. In the 18th century, an Englishman decides to create a new Bible, not reliant on the horrible Vulgate of the Masoretic text of the Jews. So, of course, he can't do it, so he's going to put out a new Christian version of the Bible. But, of course, he hires Jews because he can't read. He needs them to collect all the manuscripts and so on, and the project ends poorly. I'm speaking about who is the famous biblical English scholar who writes on biblical poetry at the end of the 18th century. He produced a beautiful volume of the prophets in English with his English translation, this metrical translation, which was no longer relied on the Masoretic text of the Jews. But then he wrote this James Kugel wrote his first book about him discovering the meter of poetry, or attempting to take Western ideas of poetry and apply them to biblical poetry. You know what I'm talking about? Anyway, it doesn't matter. But so there are examples that work, but your example is unique. I never heard anything like that. But I guess anything's possible. Anyway, there's a lot of information I crammed into this hour, but hopefully you've got a sense how print transforms Jewish culture and is a very important factor in our description of early modern Jewry. So now after the break, we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk briefly about various genres of literature that emerge in this period, and then we'll talk more about Christian racism as well. Okay, great.
William Jones?
No. The books he produced are really beautiful, but I'm trying to think. The project is the Kennicott. Kennicott was the one who wanted to create a Bible that was not relying on Masoretic text, and out of this came. Look up Kugel's first book, Biblical Poetics, and it's all about this guy.
But Kennicott made an immense catalog of Hebrew manuscripts.
Yes. But this was done together with all kinds of Jews at Mishumadim. He couldn't have done it alone. In fact, I write about the Kennicott book in my book on Jewish Enlightenment in an English key. And I found a manuscript where essentially one of his Jewish workers subject, you also have to be able to present it authoritatively. You have to be able to explain yourself. You have to articulate. You have to know how to be a great orator. So what is unique about this book if it's simply a copying job? Well, what is unique about the text is that Messalon decides the beginning of rhetoric is not in Rome or in Greece, it's in Jerusalem. And the great rhetoricians were, in fact, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. This is the beginning of literary criticism on the Bible, basically. This text, by the way, is translated into English by a guy named Isaac Rabinowitz. It's a bilingual edition. And my Renaissance historian at Penn now teaches it in the Renaissance course, which is really remarkable. We have made it into, it's one thing when we take stuff into our Jewish studies courses, but now if it goes the other way, we have something really very interesting. But it's more than that. And essentially, in a text which I wish I had in front of me, I would teach it to you right away, but we don't have the time. But let me just summarize it in 2 minutes. At the end of his discussion of memories, talking about the qualities of a good speaker, he adds his own personal remarks. And he said, I used to study the Bible like every ordinary Jew. And then I went and studied Cicero and Quintilian. And then I came back and I read the Bible. Tipakachna einai, and my eyes opened up, and all of a sudden I had a revelation. All of a sudden I appreciated something that rather than they gave us, they took from us. we were the source of all of this knowledge. In fact, if you read the Bible through rhetorical eyes, you will see its beauty and its elegance in a way that you could not see it before. And since we had all of knowledge and we lost it, now this is a topos, of course, of medieval and early modern Jewish cultural history, that, you know, we lost it because the temple was destroyed and we were exiled and, and we had all of knowledge, we were perfect. The text begins actually with an exegesis on the verse from Psalms, Torah Adonai T'mimah Mishivat Nafesh. The Torah, the Torah, how do you translate? Torah is perfect, restoring the soul. The Torah is perfect. Torah Adonai T'mimah, meaning we had it all and we lost it. And therefore, essentially, when you study rhetoric, you're not studying non-Jewish knowledge. You're essentially studying what was yours that you lost. You're restoring. Now, you know, that may sound like a ridiculous fiction, you know, that everything is Jewish. There's certain Jews, I'm sure, think like that. But nevertheless, here's the argument. So essentially, by reading the Torah, so I find now in the prophets that they were great rhetoricians, that they must have taught Cicero and Quintilian how to be rhetoricians. But the idea is that looking outside and bringing it back into my, and now studying my holy text through their methodologies, I have learned something and I've enhanced my own identity as a Jew. And the final line of this text is, and we should do this for all the sciences, not just rhetoric. So what you have here, I mean, I use this text actually, there's so many Orthodox Jewish kids at Penn, so I go into the Orthodox Jewish minyan there and I say, I want to teach you about a rabbi from the 15th century. And what I'm doing is basically asking the question, is the academic study of Judaism, Jewish studies, is it kosher for an Orthodox Jew? And it's for some of these kids who come, they go right directly to Wharton, you know, to study business. They wouldn't dare take a text with me because it's not kosher enough. And I want to argue that, look, Messer Leon said, look, rhetoric makes you a better Jew. So I try. Anyways, I use this text and I have a good time with it. But the point is that I want to argue that this text is a kind of signature of Italian Jewish culture in the 16th and 17th century. I want to argue that essentially the openness of Italian Jewish culture towards non-Jewish wisdom and its incorporation into Jewish text goes about naturally, openly, and with incredible intensity. I don't have the time to talk about a million books, but clearly rhetoric is one area. And of course, out of rhetoric comes rhetorical handbooks. Out of rhetoric comes the art of the sermon. The early modern period is a period of the sermon. Mark Saperstein, our colleague, has written on the Jewish sermon and made this into a field into itself. Jewish homiletics is an enormous field in the modern era, but it's also a very important field. It emerges in early modern Europe. It also emerges, obviously, in Spain. And we have works of drashot. But the drasha is written, and Messer Leon writes his own comments in which he compares, Judah Messer Leon, the Catholic sermon, which he has also heard, to his own sermons, which he's giving in the Venetian ghetto in Italian, which are later then translated into Hebrew. So clearly, this is an age of rhetoric, and rhetoric, therefore, has a great influence, whether Messer Leon's text was read or not, as a text which Jewish students had to learn. Within the Italian Jewish yeshivot, they were learning how to write, they were learning Latin, they were learning music and dance, and they were also, we have curriculum of Jewish studies that emerge in this period of time, and clearly they're integrating the outside with the inside. There's no question about it. I don't have time to talk about another area which is related to this is the subject of historical works. Yosef Yerushalmi has spoken about the impact of the Spanish expulsion on the writing of history as a means of consolation. I mentioned the Shevet Judah as one of the most important in this genre. But I would argue that equally significant is the place of rhetoric. History comes out of rhetoric. History comes out of the trivium. History is part of the humanistic curriculum. And that the writing of history is not simply a response to a trauma. It's also a response, it is a genre unto itself. Writing history is something that emerges in the Renaissance. And therefore, we have to understand, therefore, the relationship between rhetoric and the writing of history. And along with history is another area of autobiography, which emerges in this period of time. We have some of the most interesting autobiographies written by Jews. Leon Bodin himself writes a work called Chaye Yehuda, which is an unbelievable text in which he talks about all of his sins, gambling and fooling around, and his son gets murdered, and his wife is always carping at him and screaming at him, making him sick, and he can't wait till she dies. And it's an unbelievable book. I mean, it's a very personalized text that was not written for public audience, but later on was published. But we have several texts like this. I worked on a text written by Avram Yagel, called Gei Chizayon, The Valley of Vision. It came out, I spent 10 years, wasted 10 years of my life translating the damn thing. Called A Valley of Vision, which is both autobiography and also an ascent, a la Dante, to the heavens, where he visits the souls. He enters a Kabbalistic palace at the end and so on. A wonderful Baroque Jewish work, but also is an autobiography of how he struggled with his money lending and messed up his whole life and got involved. Some woman tried to steal all of his money, and it's an unbelievable story as well. And of course, the most famous autobiography of the early modern period is Glickel of Hamland. Glickel was a Jewish businesswoman in Germany, in Hamburg, who wrote her memoirs about her family that she had to raise by herself when her husband died. Glickel in Yiddish, one of the great classic works of Yiddish, which has a long, long history, which most recently Chavit Toriansky has put out a new critical edition of the work with a Hebrew translation. We have an English translation of it, but it's not complete. It's not totally accurate. But this becomes a classic work. So autobiography, history, these are areas which clearly a new genre within Jewish literature. Music and art. I mentioned in passing Salomon de Rossi's music written for the synagogue. We could also mention Jewish architecture, and we could mention the art of the ketubah, the art of the marriage contract, and look at the Italian ones in particular, and you will see nude little figures and all kinds of sexy things on the side and so on. Typically Italian and very ornate. And of course, within this we would put the text that I'm not going to speak about now, but we did speak about two of you already, the scientific text and the enlargement of the curriculum in the areas of science. Now, if this is Italy, to what extent does this apply to the rest of Eastern Europe? If I'm making an argument for the history of the expansion of culture within early modern Europe, am I speaking primarily about an Italian phenomenon? And my answer is, to a great extent, yes. However, let's look more closely. In the case of the Ottoman Empire, printing presses are set up very early in Constantinople and elsewhere. What emerges there, in some cases, are scientific or non-Hebraic texts, like Almos Nino, for example. In other words, written by the first generation of Spanish emigres who come to the Ottoman Empire. But the most important area which the Ottoman presses are producing is the area of Midrash. Midrash explodes in the Ottoman Empire. And all kinds of rabbinic works, in other words, homiletic works, not necessarily halachic works, but homiletical works. Clearly here, the Ottomans are close to Venice and to Italy, but the same kind of cultural interaction does not go on in the same way. It's a different kind of cultural interaction. Remember, the Ottoman world is an Islamic world. It's not a Christian world. So therefore, it is mediated by an Islamic culture, which for many of these Jews is alien to them. They are still living within their memories, as we described, of Spain and the rich Christian culture which they had to leave. In Amsterdam, of course, we are speaking about bilingual or trilingual Jews. Jews who come with a knowledge of Spanish and Portuguese, and who continue to write and to publish in Spanish and Portuguese and leave all of their manuscripts in the Eitz Chaim library in Spanish and Portuguese, which is their major language. They also know Latin. In fact, if they learn Hebrew, they learn it late. There are all kinds of Hebrew education and biblical education going on in the schools of Amsterdam. But clearly, for many, Hebrew is a language learned as adults. These are born-again Jews. These are Jews by choice, to use a 21st century expression. And therefore, Hebrew is a language which they have to learn after having been cut off from the Hebrew sources of knowledge for so much of a time. Are the Jews of Amsterdam as eager and involved in non-Jewish culture as Italy? I find the answer is no. They're more conservative, they're more careful, they're more cautious, they're more suspicious. We got to go. They're involved, I'll see you tomorrow, in Jewish-Christian relations, and therefore more polemical, more defensive. So what's interesting is that while Amsterdam is clearly an open universe, you can do everything there, smoke pot and visit the windows and all of that. I mean, I assume that was all going on in the 17th century too. But nevertheless, there's a certain conservatism about the way Jews respond to the culture around them. They're aware of it, they know it. I mean, Spanish Jews sitting in Amsterdam are reading each other Spanish poetry, which they compose, and Portuguese poetry. They're sitting around and dreaming about tapas instead of herrings and all the crazy things that the Dutch Indonesian. No, I guess they don't. I don't know what do the Dutch eat. I don't know. Heavy food and so on. So clearly Amsterdam is open, but it's not like Italy. And then, of course, when we turn to Eastern Europe, we're speaking there about a relatively insulated world, where, as Gershon Hundred puts it, there's no great attraction to being like the non-Jews or imitating the non-Jews or reading their literature and so on. And therefore, what we see is primarily a Hebraic culture, a rabbinic culture. On the other hand, the boundaries are porous, they're open, they're not totally closed. So again, the mobility of books that we described in the Mikrot Gedolot making its way into Poland, Lithuania, suggests indeed the possibility of ideas coming from the outside. Moses Isserlis writes a work on science. It's outdated, but nevertheless he works on science. He could have gone to Krakow and maybe hung out with the Copernicans, but he doesn't do that. I mean, he's still isolated. But nevertheless, he is aware of the importance of astronomy in the study of Jewish culture. The student of Isserlis and also the student of the Maharal, David Gans, in Prague, actually writes two works of great interest. One is a history called Tzemach David, a history both of the Jews and of non-Jewish culture, in which he describes Rudolf II of Prague and describes how the Maharal of Prague, the rabbi of Prague, went and visited Rudolf, and they closed their doors and they talked in secret. And now we know from a brilliant find by Joanna Weinberg in London. Have you heard about this? She discovered in a folio of a Christian Hebraist a letter written by two Hebraists who came from England, and they say that the Maharal opened up his house to them, and they studied with him for 6 months Hebrew and Jewish subjects. Now that's revolutionary. The idea that the Maharal of Prague would be teaching Christians is really quite unbelievable. In the 60s there was a great debate, this is primarily for Javier, between Jacob Katz and Ben Sasson. Is Prague open or closed? Are Jews indifferent to Christian culture, or are they not indifferent? Was the court of Rudolf II attractive to Jews, or was the Maharal doing his own Orthodox thing and had nothing to do with the rest of the world? But here we have the great rabbi of Prague teaching Christian Hebraist, which is really quite unbelievable if that text is accurate. She's going to publish this text very soon. In any case, so David Gans publishes his history. He also publishes a work called Nechmad V'Naim. I love the title of it. Nechmad V'Naim means how good and how pleasant. A scientific text in which he describes at the end of the text, this is Prague now, this is Central Europe. It's not exactly Eastern Europe, but it's close, right? So in Prague, he mentions the fact that Rudolf II invites the great astronomer Tycho Brahe. Remember Tycho? You know your history of astronomy? Tycho Brahe created a system of astronomy between Ptolemy and Copernicus, in which he tried to find a compromise between the two positions, the heliocentric versus the geocentric view of the universe. Tycho Brahe is invited to spend several months working in the telescope, the observatory in Prague. And David Gans describes the fact that he was invited there for 2 weeks. And he sits and he talks to Tycho Brahe and he looks through the telescope and he sees all of God's stars and it's a wondrous thing. And look, me, the Jew, in my day and age, I got invited to sit with all the great scientists. And what a wonderful accomplishment. So Prague is not Italy, right? Now, Prague is also a Renaissance capital in the 16th century. And it is close, of course. And David Gans is also a student in Krakow. So we are close, right? So Krakow has its own Renaissance. So through the mobility of books, through Sephardic scholars, I should mention Spain here, Sephardic scholars, conversos, who make their way as doctors there are a whole bunch of them in Eastern Europe. They're sitting in Hamburg. They have a whole community sitting in Hamburg. And of course in Amsterdam as well. So that through visitors coming from the relationship between Italy and Prague, for example, and then Prague and Krakow, create the possibilities of borders being broken. Again, what was going on in Italy like the rest of Europe? No. But nevertheless, the possibilities are there. Books are being printed and so on. Now this finally brings me, I think it's a good time to shift. I didn't do a great job with this, but I gave you some idea of what I was talking about. I now want to shift to bring in the Christian into our story. And this is a very important part of the story, not just for Christian history, but for Jewish history. Because how Jews react to this, how they respond, how they understand a dynamic new relationship between Christians and Jews is really also a part of the story of early modern Jewry and is part of this knowledge explosion. So let's take a step backward now. So the history of Christianity and Judaism is a long history of supersessionism, of animosities, of competition, of discrimination, of atrocities, the Crusades, the 13th century, polemics. We have a long history of what Baron called, in reference to previous Jewish historiography, the lachrymose view of Jewish history. Lachrymose is an English word meaning a sorrowful, a bad, the history of Jewish-Christian relations is a history of discrimination and hostility. Yes, but there's also but it's much more complex than that. Clearly, this phenomenon emerges very early in the Middle Ages. I don't want to give only credit to the early modern period, although it accelerates, it expands 10 times in terms of its significance in the early modern period. I'm referring to the need on the part of Christians to study Hebrew texts, the need to study the Hebrew Bible, the need to understand biblical exegesis through Jews, the need to explore Jewish knowledge that is both biblical and post-biblical. And I could give you many examples of this in the Middle Ages. I think the two most important are the reception of Maimonides in the Christian world. We have plenty of work that's been done on Maimonides, not necessarily his Mishneh Torah, but his Moreh Nevuchim, his Guide to Biblical Text. In other words, the philosophical culture of Jews and its impact upon Latin culture and translations. Very important story unto itself. And sitting in a group that was studying the 13th century last year, I heard so much about the dissemination of knowledge about translations from the Arabic into Hebrew, into Latin, and so on, and the importance of this Hebraic culture within Latin medieval culture. The other example is, of course, Rashi, the great commentator from the 11th century in northern France, and the impact of his commentary on the Bible, of course on the Talmud too, but on the Bible, on Christian exegesis. And I refer specifically to the Victorines in Paris, to Nicholas de Lyra, to a whole group of Christians who study rabbinic texts, but primarily Rashi. And also Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra is another very important medieval exegete that is known really quite well in the Middle Ages, but is referred to by Pico and the Renaissance scholars as Rabbi Abraham, and everybody knows who he is, Ibn Ezra and so on, and editions of his work are coming out in Latin as well. He was also interested in astrology and astronomy, and this also enters into the Christian world. But in the early modern period, we have an intensification of an enormous degree of the rediscovery of the Hebrew book. And we've already alluded to it in the case of Bamberg and the things I said in the previous hour, but let me step back now and really situate it in several stages. The first stage I want to talk about is in Tuscany at the end of the 15th century, surrounding the figure Pico della Mirandola. And I'm just going to write Pico, all right? And my students in Penn would think that's something on an Italian menu, but it's actually a guy named Pico. Pico della Mirandola. What we have is this great humanist, Aristotelian, but a Neoplatonic philosopher who rediscovers with Marsilio Ficino the Hermetic text. I spoke about them. Where did I speak about them? Here or in my lecture yesterday? I can't remember already. And clearly discovers Hebrew as a priority for Christians, Hebrew studies, and in particular Kabbalah. This is a remarkable story that has now been studied by a whole group of scholars, and we have an awful lot. Recently I was at the Renaissance Society for America at their meeting in San Diego a couple of months ago, and Brian Copenhaver, who is a professor at UCLA, that's another one you should write down, who works on Pico and on his Jewish, gave a lecture which basically was stolen in part. Now that's too strong because he acknowledged it fully. It wasn't stolen, but he was relied heavily upon Moshe Idel. When I was a undergraduate student, we would read the great books. This was a particular way, you know, I don't know if you have courses like this in Universidad Complutense, where you read through the great books of the Western tradition. It was always Western European men. There were never any women, and of course it was over Europe, you know, because Europe was the center of the world and so on. See how the world has changed. But basically one of these texts was the Oration on the Dignity of Man. Do you know this text? Did you ever read Pico, the Oration on the Dignity of Man? Which is a kind of declaration which Burckhardt and the 19th century historians declared. The Renaissance was breaking off from the yokes of Christianity, and now man, the microcosm, was the center of the universe, as opposed to God, who had been the center of the universe for the medievals. And the Renaissance was a kind of revolution, a secular revolution against the religious oppression of the Middle Ages. Well, how wrong that view is, we have discovered, you know, as time has gone on. But Brian Copenhaver gave a lecture in which he argued, based on Moshe Idel, that this is basically a magical Hermetic text based on Kabbalistic sources. And it's basically Pico pronouncing what the Renaissance is, totally based on Kabbalah. Now when I heard Moshe Idel give a lecture on this years ago, I said, this is Israeli Jewish chauvinism. It's what Messer Leon was doing. He's saying, you know, rhetoric, it's really us. It's not from Cicero and Quintilian, it comes from Jews. Because the Jews created everything, you know, they're the smart ones, everybody else is stupid. But all of a sudden now, Brian Copenhaver, who is not a Jewish scholar, you know, he's a scholar of the Renaissance, is giving this lecture in which he's showing that all of the texts that he's using come from Abraham Abulafi and a whole group of other medieval Hebrew sources. So when I studied the Renaissance, when I was an undergraduate, I don't know how many years ago, a long time ago, there were just white, you know, Catholic or Protestant men walking around. You know, there weren't any Jews in the Renaissance. What are Jews? Now the Jews are the authors of the great text of the Renaissance. How does Pico get to Hebrew and to Kabbalistic sources? Well, this is a long lecture in itself, which I can't give. But let me mention just one avenue. One of his ideas, which is an idea also of Marsilio Ficino, his colleague, is the idea of Prisca Theologia, or ancient theology. These Christians believed, and they published their theses, which were then criticized by the Catholic Church, but nevertheless they published them as Christians. These were not seculars, by the way, these were serious Christians. That essentially all human knowledge is the purview of a Christian. The ancient secular texts of the Hermetics in ancient Egypt, and Greek texts, and also Hebrew texts, and essentially what we have is a mosaic of cultures. And what we need to do through what he calls also poetic theology is to read and decipher these texts like hieroglyphics. And by so doing, we will be able to find a single truth, a universal truth, which is the truth of Jesus Christ. So in other words, this is a kind of universalism, a cosmopolitanism on the one hand. But of course, it's also Christian hegemony. It's a universalism which is only Christian. I mean, you can't... So essentially what Pico is saying to the Jews, I don't want to fight you anymore. I don't want to polemize with you. I don't want to tell you that my Christianity is superior to your Judaism or vice versa. I want to embrace you with my love. I want to take you into my universal notion. I need you to make me a better Christian. And by so doing, you become part of me. And therefore you come out of your ghetto and you enter into the larger world, and we can embrace your values. I once had a professor, a colleague at Yale, when I was at Yale, Louis Dupre. He was a Belgian, I don't know what he was doing during the Holocaust, but he was a really weird guy that had no use for Jews. But when he discovered the Kabbalah, all of a sudden, it was wonderful. And Hillel once invited him to speak to a group of Jews. Hillel is our Jewish organization on campus. And he got up and said, you Jews have been holding this treasure only to yourself. You can only share the Kabbalah with us Christians. We can embrace each other in a kind of unity. So from that point on, I call Louis Dupre Reuchlin. I mean, that's basically, that was what Reuchlin was saying about... But essentially, it's not universalism. It's aggrandizement. It's stealing Jewish materials and making them Christian. In fact, what I'm talking about now is the emergence of Christian Kabbalah. Essentially, Pico took Jewish texts. He had a guy named Flavius Mithridates, a former Sicilian rabbi who converted to Christianity, and he spent his entire life translating Hebrew texts, a Hebrew library for Pico. Pico knew some Hebrew, but he wasn't a great Hebraist. But through this library, I mean, he had Jewish philosophy, he had exegesis, he had Kabbalah, and some crazy Italian in Germany is trying to publish all of these texts in critical editions in Rome. I'm talking about Giulio Bussi. It'll never happen. And why do we need to publish them is another question, but all of these manuscripts are in the Vatican Library. They're all there. They're intact, completely there. So you could spend your whole life studying how so what did Mithridates do? He translated all these texts, but he knew his teacher wanted to see trinities all over the place. He wanted to see Christianity in these texts. He didn't want to just study them for their own sake. So he sticks in his translations trinities. He makes them, they're interpolations. They're not just translations. So what he ends up with are texts that are loaded with the possibility of seeing Christianity in Hebrew texts. Now, of course, in the Middle Ages, going back to Raymond Martinez and so on, Christians had used Jewish texts to prove the truth of Christianity. That wasn't anything new here. What was new was that Pico was not necessarily writing to Jews to polemicize with them. He was essentially using this material to revive, to energize Christianity, to make Christians better Christians. And therefore, Kabbalah was at the center of his concern. He, in fact, has one thesis in which he says, you cannot fulfill yourself as a Christian unless you study Magia and Kabbalah. And notice he puts them together, because for him, Kabbalah is a higher version of magic. Magic is a very important part of our story, too. Ficino himself wrote very important works on magic. So Renaissance magic and Kabbalah go together. What emerges in this period of time, beginning with Pico, and then in Germany with Johannes Reuchlin, another very important figure who writes on the Kabbalah, is the emergence of a group of scholars who study the Kabbalah as a means of reviving, energizing, understanding Christianity in a new universal way. Kabbalah is not simply a field, a subject. Kabbalah for them is also a tool of exegesis. You know, the Kabbalists have their methods of understanding the text. For example, gematria, right? That every Hebrew letter is equivalent to numbers. And thus you can find all kinds of secrets. In other words, by reading the text Kabbalistically, through the methods of the way Kabbalists read, we can understand the secrets which will lead us ultimately back to Jesus Christ. That's what Pico is saying. Moreover, we can take Kabbalistic methods and apply them to reading Greek texts and Latin texts. It gets a little crazy. Reading Kabbalistic hermeneutic can open up the way we read other kinds of texts. So therefore, Kabbalah was an esoteric knowledge. It was related to magic. It was part of this mosaic of cultural disciplines. It was a way of deciphering all kinds of culture and a way of enhancing and enriching Christianity. So the first stage, therefore, of Christian Hebraicism is Christian Kabbalah. This process continues throughout the 16th century, and I can mention a whole group of names, Egidio Viterbo and all kinds of other figures in the 16th century. It goes into France, it goes into England, it goes into a group in England called the Cambridge Platonists, who didn't know very much Kabbalah, but they thought they did. And then it ultimately emerges at the end of the 17th and 18th century with an extraordinary compendium of Latin knowledge called the Kabbalah Denudata. I love the title of the book. And on the front page of the book is this woman, with her breasts. She's giving out. Kabbalah Denudata. She's not naked. Denudata, of course, is denuded, right? What's the Spanish word? Same. But the Kabbalah Denudata by a man named von Rosenroth, a group of German Christian Kabbalists, is an attempt to bring together all the major Kabbalistic texts in Latin translation, including Lurianic Kabbalah of the 16th century. This text and this circle has been studied by Alison Couder and others, and is an extraordinary example of the flourishing of Kabbalah, and even she also wrote a subsequent book on the impact of Kabbalah on Leibniz. So Kabbalah and Christian and on Spinoza. Then we have a whole long history here of the impact of Kabbalistic thought in a Christian context that enters the non-Jewish world. Much of it is distorted, much of it is transformed, and just my last sentence, and it becomes a Christian Kabbalah. It's no longer a Jewish Kabbalah. In other words, I have to emphasize that point. The relationship to Judaism becomes tenuous after a while. It is really part of a narrative, of a cultural experience which is totally Christian. Go on.
Just look at the name of the author. About the
Kabbalah Denudata. Alison Couder, Coudert. Be careful with her work, though. Some people don't like it, but it's really very interesting. She also, if you're interested in this subject, one of the great books on this subject is a book that we published at Penn. We had a whole year. It was one of my dream years. I bring together 20 scholars every year, and so we had a year on Christian Hebraicism. If you were probably in high school then, but Tony Grafton and Moshe Dell organized the group, and we had a group of extraordinarily smart people that spent the whole year studying Christian Hebraicism. And at the end of the year, we published a book which has been edited by Alison Couder and Jeffrey Schulzen. I can't remember the title of the work, but there are some brilliant essays on Christian Hebraicism, including an essay by our friend Amnon Razmer-Kotzkin. That's a very important volume. And that, we publish at the end of the year that we have at Penn, we publish a volume, which we're going to publish the year that Javier is edited, as soon as Javier finishes his article.
Hebraica Veritas, Christian Hebraist, and the study of
yeah, something like that. So it's called Hebraica Veritas.
Hebraica Veritas.
Yeah. So that's the name of the book.
Christian Hebraist and the study of Judaism in the early modern Europe.
Now, in addition, how much time do I have? No, 7 minutes. In addition to Christian Kabbalah, which I've spoken about up to now, this is not the only area in which Christians become involved with Hebrew books, and I've already talked about the printing press and Christian printing. If one looks at Northern Europe, particularly Germany, the Low Countries, there is an interest in Hebrew exegesis and the study of the Bible. Obviously, within the Protestant world, the Bible takes first priority, sola scriptura. But the need for studying biblical commentaries, Sebastian Munster, a whole group of Reformation scholars are very much involved with studying Hebrew grammar, biblical grammar, and are also making their way into biblical exegetical tradition. So this is another field of study. When one enters the 17th and 18th century, however, it becomes even more complicated and rich. The great scholars, and I'm thinking of Grafton's work on Scaliger, for example, or Buxdorf. Some of the great figures of the 17th and 18th century were polymaths. They came to Hebrew not as an isolated phenomenon, but in relationship to Arabic studies. The whole history of Hebrew and Arabic is a critical aspect, that they were linked together right up until the 20th century. Right? I mean, we should really appreciate that. At the university positions in Europe where Hebrew was taught by Christians or by former Jews who were Christians, they were also teaching Arabic studies. In other words, Semitic studies went together. And therefore Hebrew and Arabic were really related fields. But these were polymaths that studied Latin and Greek and also other languages. They were learning, for example, with the appearance of the Polyglot Bible, they were learning Aramaic, they were learning Syriac. They even discovered in the 16th and 17th century the Samaritan holy books, which were printed in the Polyglot Bibles. And in other words, they were essentially working in 10 or 11 languages, like Theo Dunkelgru. He's our friend who knows all these languages. And clearly, Hebrew therefore becomes an essential part, but you can't study Hebrew in isolation to these other disciplines. So essentially, Scaliger, who knew an enormous amount about Hebrew and Hebrew calendars and so on, also knew about Greek and Latin and Arabic and all kinds of other languages and so on, and clearly. Or recently, Joanna Weinberg's and Tony Grafton's book on Isaac Koseban. This is Koseban, we knew to be an extraordinary, important figure in the history of modern, early modern European culture, Greek and Latin and Arabic. They discovered Hebrew books, Hebrew annotations, and they recently published, Joanna Weinberg and Tony Grafton together, they're going to be at my center next year, they published their work on Kosovan. Buxdorf also worked in many languages and cultures and so on. So clearly, therefore, Christian Hebraicism is, on the one hand, a field of study for Christians, but ultimately also becomes part of the rich encyclopedic knowledge of scholarship, of the history of scholarship by the 17th and 18th century. And therefore, the more spiritual roots of it in Christian Kabbalah are overtaken by a more academic, a more scholarly approach to the subject of Hebrew and Hebrew text. And therefore, the variety of texts that are read in a variety of fields, philosophical, historical, even halachic. I mentioned in this regard the discovery of the Mishnah by scholars. I want to mention one work which to me is an extraordinary example of this, and I think I'll close with this. At the end of the 18th century, a professor at the University of Amsterdam named Wilhelm Sorenusius, I'm going to try to spell that. I don't know if I can do it, but let's see. Starts out like this, Sorenusius, something like that. Begins a process that had actually, or finishes a process that had began 100 years earlier. And that is to recover the Mishnah for Christians. Now, we're not talking about Bible. We're not even talking about biblical exegesis. We're talking about a Jewish law book that was codified around the year 200 CE, which is the basis of Talmud. The Talmud is essentially the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Gemara are the elaborations on the Mishnah. The Mishnah was, of course, the first layer of the Talmudic book, and therefore the Christians felt its relevance because it was closest to Jesus and Jesus' time. By the 7th and 18th century, there was an explosion of new texts in different languages. Christianity is finding itself, or Christian theology is finding itself unstable in a certain sense. that these new texts and these new finds are what is the origins of Christianity? Where do we stand? How can we understand ourselves? One avenue which Christian theologians take is to rediscover the rabbinic context in which Jesus lived. This didn't begin only in the 20th century, it begins in the 18th century. So Cyrenius, after several aborted attempts, beginning with a Sephardic Jew named Abindenda in London, to translate the Mishnah into Latin, he proceeds to take all of these previous translations, and in 6 unbelievably large folio volumes, he publishes the entire Latin Mishnah with the 2 standard commentaries, Maimonides and Bertinora, and a 3rd commentary written by Wilhelm Cyrenius. He had the chutzpah to put his own commentary together with Maimonides and Bertinora on the same page, with illustrations and pictures, with diagrams, beautifully, with wonderful introductions, in which he talks about how he has this love affair with Judaism, and which he says the following, that if you want to be a good Christian, you need to know the Mishnah. In fact, Cyrenius and his disciples introduced into Christian seminaries the study of the Mishnah. Now, one other work that Cyrenius wrote, which needs to be examined, I'm looking for a doctoral student that really knows Latin well that could work on him, because he's really incredible. He wrote a work called, it has a Greek, a Latin, and a Hebrew title. And I can't even remember any of the titles. Sefer HaMashveh or something. What it is the following. He tells a story of how he faced a crisis in his life. I can't figure out why, when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it always misquotes it. There's something going on here. Why? I need to connect better. People are arguing that the New Testament is not legitimate because it doesn't quote the Old Testament well. The whole foundation of Christian exegesis is in crisis. He's sitting on a bench in Amsterdam, and he meets there a rabbi. The rabbi he had been a Christian, but he became back to be a rabbi and so on. The rabbi listens to his dilemma and he said, very simple, learn rabbinic exegesis and you'll understand the New Testament is quoting like the rabbis quote. They have a certain way of quoting. So he sent him back to the Sheva Midot of Hillel, the 7, how do you call them? The hermeneutical principles of Hillel. And then there were 32 of Yishmael. These are principles by which rabbis interpret Jewish texts. For example, and you've got to use your hands. If this is the case, how much the more so? Kal v'chomer, that's Kal v'chomer. If this is the case here, how much the more so is it the case? You have to use your hands to do this. That's a rabbinic way. All right. So essentially, Cyrenius published the 32 principles, explaining them one by one in the first part of the book, and then in the second part of the book he tries to use them in reading the New Testament. It's an incredible text. You should work on this text. You know a lot about this period, about this stuff. It's absolutely amazing text. So we have, I mean, when I was in rabbinical school, we read Hermann Struck. Wasn't it Hermann Struck? He gave us, it was a kind of book that was published in English, giving us all the hermeneutical principles, giving us all names of the books of the Mishnah and the Talmud and so on. So we have this already at the beginning of the 18th century. It was published in 1713, this book, Sefer HaMashveh. So Cyrenius creates a Mishnah for Christians, and he finds that the rabbinic understandings can lead us to understanding the New Testament better. The final question is, what does this all mean? Can you love a Jewish book and hate Jews? And the answer is yes. Remember, this is the period of the Inquisition. This is the period of ghettos. What I want to point out is that loving books doesn't necessarily make people more humane or more humanistic. I've hung around universities for 40 years, and I can testify to that. Education doesn't necessarily make you more moral or more ethical. That's the reality of life. But on the other hand, there's always the potential, right? I mean, you always believe that that a person that loves Hebrew and that loves books can't help but love Jews or love the people that wrote these books, right? I mean, you always believe that potentially it's always possible. or that in some cases Christian Hebraists became so close to Judaism they even converted to Judaism. We have a very interesting book by Martin Moslow and History of Skepticism, Richard Popkin, called Secret Conversions in Early Modern Europe, which is a book about a group of Christians who converted to Judaism. Very few of them, but there were few. They did it in Amsterdam, by the way. That was the place to do it. You could go convert back and forth, and so Amsterdam is open. So in any case, the story is a story of how Christians utilize Jewish learning to enhance themselves primarily. And it is a very important part of the shaping of early modern culture. And we are now in a period where a whole group of people are being studied. Grafton and Joanna Romberg now are creating a new book on Johannes Buxdorf, another very important figure who translates all of these Hebrew texts and so on. Did Buxdorf love Jews? Not necessarily. But nevertheless, Jewish learning became an important part of Christian culture. So this is what I call knowledge explosion. It affects Jews, it affects Christians, it affects Jewish-Christian relations, and it is a very important ingredient in the story that we have been describing. So, I am done. We have one more week next week where I want to talk about crisis, mingled identities, and the end of this era. I hope I can do it in 2 hours again. But I thank you for your attention. Unfortunately, I've been lecturing and you haven't been asking many questions or comments, and he hasn't challenged me yet, but that's okay. But please, if you can, read the book because it's told better there. And read all the bibliography that I gave in the book. Any questions or comments? Yeah, go on, Judge.
Do we have time for questions? Is there time?
Yeah, go on. You want one question? Go on.
Oh, okay. No, I had a question about the Christian Hebraism and the relationship between the scholarly motives and the theological motives. Because on one hand, right, Christian Hebraism, there's all these sort of emerging Christian theologies, especially Messianisms, which use Judaism and Jewish learning to sort of invigorate their sort of new forms of Christianity. But on the other hand, the scholarship can actually undermine a lot of Christianity, right? And sort of be used, especially historicizing scholarship, can actually sort of undermine sort of the foundations of Christian dogma. So what's the relationship between the sort of scholarly project and the
That's a hard question,
theological project?
and that's a very good question. Peter Miller once addressed the question to me in this way. Well, put it this way. Initially, the scholarship that you're talking about in the 17th century comes to support Christianity.
Right.
Or at least the deist firm of Christianity.
But it ends up undermining itself also.
You know, ultimately undermines, you're right, but it also comes to sustain Christian traditions. I mean, part of these scholars are really Christian scholars and so on. I think the answer is not simple. I think what we need is we don't have a homogeneous picture of Christian Hebraicism. Rather, I began with this very spiritualist tendency which begins in the 15th century as early as Pico and Reuchlin, but then a more scholarly approach seems to dominate. But nevertheless, you can't say one without the other. I mean, all of these people are influenced by their own Christian identity and their own Christian concerns. I mean, the Reformers are doing their own thing in terms of the Bible and have their own particular interests. So I think their scholarship is colored by their spirituality. I don't know if you can totally separate the two.
No,
and also another aspect is their own social attitude towards Jews.
Right.
In Tony Grafton's book on Kosovan, they are very troubled by the idea of this guy spends all of his time studying Hebrew, but does he have any contact with Jews and actually talk to living and breathing Jews? At the end, they discover one Jew that helped Kosovan read texts, and he was put in jail, and Kosovan tried to get him out. So it showed that Kosovan was, trying to be a real friend of a Jew. That may be, more of a 21st century, authors trying to find something good about this whole enterprise that's, in the area of social relations. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think my answer would be, I think you have to look at individuals, and I think we're not ready to generalize here. I think there are all kinds of motivations, and sometimes they complement each other, sometimes they contradict each other. I think generally speaking, the scholarship becomes more prominent in a later period as I've described it. But I think there are also spiritual elements that are involved there. And what's really interesting is the autobiographies of these Christian Hebraists, which I think need to be studied. I mean, why did they get so infatuated with this Hebrew text? They were then accused of being Judaizers. Yeah. And another element in this story, which is really absolutely fascinating, is the element of the competition Karlbach has written about this. The competition in her book on converts, between converts who essentially, when they convert, Jews who convert to Christianity in Germany, how can they make a living? They're poor, they're ravished. Some of them become specialists on Judaism, and some of them even get positions in Christian universities. But then they're pushing out Christian Hebraists. In other words, there's a competition between Christian Hebraists and the converts, which is a very interesting dynamic in itself. Who are speaking, who can read these Hebrew texts better? Obviously the converts came with Jewish backgrounds, and the Christian Hebraists are learning for them, on their own how to read Christian Hebrew texts and so on. So it's a very complicated story, and I would argue that we haven't even identified who all the Christian Hebraists are. There are amazing how many people who hated Jews were reading Hebrew books in this period of time, and how many Hebrew books were published under the auspices of Christians, and how much collaboration is going on, and the printing press and so on. And then you start to look at their motivations and their attitudes, and how they come to this and so on. You have a whole range. I would argue, the Kabbalah Denudata, for example, that circle of Christians who are translating those Kabbalistic texts, they're spiritual. They're messianic, as you put it. They're in their own world. But they're also creating scholarly editions. So the scholarship goes hand in hand with their spirituality.
Yeah.
But it's a great question. I don't think we can answer it yet, fully.
No, thank you.
I had enough. Are we still going to go to eat something? All right, so you're welcome to come and join us.